Okay, so welcome back. It's exciting to see you all again. This is our last session, so we have a lot to cover from the readings, and also I would like to start discussing a little bit of your own practice. So we'll connect artistic agency with the readings, and then we'll land on your practice. So last week we didn't finish all the readings, there were too many. So this week we're going to start with a reading on mobility, performing the fantasy of mobility while enacting the violence of immobility. So what is this reading about? Specifically, now that we have to rethink mobility, now that we have to rethink place and space and time and history, what is this reading about? Who wants to go first? And I can't see everyone, so you can just turn on your microphone and
I'll jump in,
Mhm.
unless someone else wants to go.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. So the performing the fantasy of mobility. I think if I'm looking at lots of pages of notes, but mobility is a problematic term because it's composed of many moving parts in a way, right? And it is a privilege. It is the mobility. Like if I had been able to go to Peru, that is a privilege that I have. That there are a lot of people who don't, and then there's an exchange, because if I have something, it is kind of a little bit of a zero sum in a way. If I have it, someone else doesn't. So but then it's also part of the colonial system where I had it and then I lost it. I'm sorry. So but like it's built in to Western uh, uh, society, I believe, is this idea of mobility.
Right, right. Yes, it is. Well, first, it leads to the question that you're asking. It's how do we move has to do, how we understand mobility has to do with how do we move, how we move around, but also how with mobility there's immobility. So for instance, to establish the European Union as a space or as a place more than a space that has the possibility of everyone, and that's quote unquote, moving freely, that again, quote unquote, it requires a larger system of immobility for everyone else. And that also applies to the idea of borders. So the question that I want to ask is, how is mobility invested in the invention of place? How is the idea of mobility and the concept of mobility connected to the invention of place? Yes, Jocelyn.
So places are defined a lot now by nationalism, and you have, citizenship in certain nations. And if you don't have citizenship, that greatly limits your ability to travel because you don't have a passport, or you could be in a place and you don't have the rights of a citizen to be there. And so it's based a large part in nationalism and who is recognized as a citizen in countries, which has a lot to do with, of course, colonialism, racism, classism.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Jocelyn. Yes, it is connected to this idea of the public and the private. It is how citizenship becomes the crystallization of all these ideas, and how we move around has to do since the 19th century with the idea of citizenship, and how we exercise immobility of others so that our mobility, and this is also, this article is of course using the idea of past as place that Sharon Holland is talking about. It is also rethinking how we think about spaces and places. And so we're going to keep thinking about how space becomes place and how it is connected to these systems that cannot be separated from history. It is also connected to the reading um, on Rwanda and how yes, how Rwanda was also invented, in terms of Africa, in terms of what images can represent, in terms of agency. So, what else do we find in this reading? What is what? And one of the big questions that I think is necessary to be addressed is the idea of Western, Westerner, West. All of these is quote unquote. Jesse.
Jesse. Hi. So, hello, first of all. So, something, well, first of all, you, in the reading, you spoke a lot about the European as a kind of nomad, somebody moving around, and that's like this image that has been constructed around the European. And then I found it very interesting to juxtapose that with the colonized body as immobile, which kind of forever traps them in this same box, which relates, I think, to the Orientalism reading, and yeah, how just with this concept of mobility, you can trap someone in this idea of place forever.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It creates this idea of them and us. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, because when we read these these theoretical ideas to understand place, we also have to think about that it goes both ways. So, when we think about the Americas and how they were invented as past as a place, it is also it also comes with effects on the other side. So if we imagine that we are on the side of controlling time, it is also an illusion that is actually eventually going to be used against us. And these we can see, for instance, with the pandemic. When specific groups decide that they are not going to get infected because they claim they're actually on the side of time, it's an illusion. That's how it's also a distortion. So what I want to clarify is that this relationship in the encounter, when one is imagined as existing in place in the past, and the other one is imagining existing while controlling time, because it's a distortion, in both ways, it's leading to destruction. In both ways, it's getting closer to extermination. And that's also why I use the example of the pandemic, because in any of the sites that we imagine we are, and this is how I think this is the missing part of the conversation. It's not that one imagines has a chip on their shoulder. We got the shorter end of the stick, and because of colonization, and because no, everyone will be exterminated. It doesn't matter if we imagine we are on the side of time or on the side of place. This is why distortions are so dangerous. And one of the things that I want to distinguish is the idea of movement as opposed to mobility. What will be the difference between movement and mobility?
I think movement is an action, whereas mobility is a privilege or or a right you claim for yourself.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
okay.
right. And I would change the idea of privilege so that we understand that it's ideologically loaded. Because privilege, to me, it still has that sort of note, that sort of taste that we are on the side of time. And it doesn't matter which side we claim, we're all going to be exterminated. Unless we change that idea. So mobility is loaded with ideology. It's not the process of moving, it's the act of moving through ideology. This is also why I quote Kirsten Buick idea on mobility, because many artists traffic on race. or traffic on gender, or traffic on margins. This is the difference between moving and trafficking. So when we think about the idea of movement, how could we define movement? We're talking about the difference between mobility and movement. Mobility is loaded with ideology. So what would movement be? And there's, of course, a connection between movement, time, and space. Yes, Sayani.
According that I understand in the reading, movement is the capacity, the condition of feel freedom, and but freedom in certain way with time and space could be also an invention. I don't know if I understand.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. Freedom is an invention because we always experience freedom at the expense of others. There are scholars that argue that freedom, we all have freedom, and I'm not quite sure it's true. I think freedom is an invention that it's sticky. It's like trying to explain oxygen in every conversation. It's just a given. However, freedom is actually loaded with ideology. And it has a vicious history in relation not only to the United States, because it's the United States invented freedom in relation to the Americas, but also it informed the Americas. And as an example, I always refer to how all the ideas of Jefferson inform the movements of independence in the Americas, specifically in Latin America. However, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he had legally in his possession 175 enslaved human beings. And we could contextualize this and rationalize it and try to justify it. The reality is that when Latin America started to become independent, Jefferson was against that idea. He said racially, Latin America would get drunk with freedom. And this is still a discourse that remains in the air, how Latin America is incapable of being free, and therefore it justifies intervention.
Okay.
So yes. So how do we relate this idea of movement with time and space?
Can I go?
Yes, yes, of course, Rita, go ahead.
I think talking about mobility and you've got movement, like Sayani said, how it's like an invention. You're sort of conceptualizing many things at the same time. So it's not just this constant flow of something that's going on. It's you're taking in so much information at once, but there's only a limited amount of information that we can take on at a time. So it's about you're conceptualizing that after it's happened with movement, I think, not always at that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And in that sense, movement is it's a condition. It's I think that's the word that I could get closer to it. It's a reality that we never stay the same. We never remain the same. It is the idea that Sharon Holland talks about in terms of friction, that also Frantz Fanon, that Audre Lorde talks about as well, is this reality that we are always moving. We never stay the same. Yes, Daniela, it's actually change. Yes, change. It's that condition, that reality that it's contingent to time and space, and time and space are both relationships. Yes. So any questions so far in terms of Western movement? We haven't defined West and Western yet. We'll get to that. Any questions so far? And we're going to start weaving all these concepts into the rest of the readings until we land on the practice. So
I have a quick question.
Yes,
Sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Is in a sense like, and I may be jumping a little too far, but isn't mobility as defined in this article almost definitionally the same as Western or white, whereas it's only defined by what it is the absence of, it's or what it's in opposition to. It has to, something has to be oppressed for it to exist, is it, or where it's in that category of things we're talking about, right?
Right,
Or,
right,
okay.
absolutely, because what we have to remember is that these are all inventions. It's just like Europe and the Americas. Europe can only exist in relation to the Americas and the rest of the world. So mobility is also, can only exist with immobility. If immobility wouldn't exist, then mobility, it's clear that it doesn't exist. Yes, and yes, it is related to all these concepts that emerge since the 16th century. So it's also related to how property was invented, how then place is, as a distortion, is invented in terms instead of space. So yes, absolutely. And when we think about West, Western, Westerner, is connected to what Rusty just said. It is how there is an impossibility to name, yet is imagining a position in relation to power, yet it's everything horrific that has happened and will continue to happen to everyone. And this is also how we tie together the argument about time and space. Whether we decide or we try to negotiate a relationship between time and history and place, whether we claim that we are on the side of time or we are forced to be existing in place. And we're going to unpack that when we also think about the erotic life of racism. It doesn't matter because both sides will always be exterminated.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Daniela.
It's like mobility is like setting limitations on movement. Is what I understand. Is
absolutely, exactly. Yes, yes. It's ideologically loaded. And then Mark is asking: is movement like indicating a presence in time and space, like particles, a marker only? I think movement is a condition. It's a reality that the Earth is moving, the solar system is moving, every atom, every cell, everything within us is moving, and also the reality that when we encounter, and I know encounter is a word loaded with also ideology. Sometimes we can use contact, sometimes we can use meeting, sometimes face-to-face encounters, so on and so forth. But it is the reality that when we encounter, when we establish contact, we don't remain the same because of friction, because of change. So now we're going to connect. You guys have any questions so far? Okay, so now we're going to connect with two readings about artistic agency, and we're going to begin with the idea Works of Edmonia Lewis by Kristen Buick. What do we find in this reading? What is this reading about? And who can give a little bit of a context on the reading? Yes, Jocelyn.
Kirsten analyzes or looks at the work of Edmonia Lewis, and she talks a lot about, let me see if I can find the work. Many times artwork is conflated with biography, so people think that every work of art that they make is based on their biography, and people will often, when they're talking about work in art history or critiques, they conflate like the artist with their work.
Yes.
And so she looks into the idea that in her ideal works, the features of the women in Monia Lewis's sculptures do not look Indian and they don't look African American.
Mhm.
And so she's thinking about why that is when the men do look, the men have like the markers of race in her work.
Mhm.
And usually like the clothing will show race, but the features don't. And so her conclusion is that she did not want to be conflated with her work.
Mhm.
And that created a sense of agency for her because she knew that when people would look at it, they would see her. If the women in her sculptures looked like her. And so people often wrote about her as like kind of like a victim of her circumstances and only in terms of like contemporaries. And they talked constantly about like her being Native American and African. And so her agency was in creating these sculptures that when we finally look at them, we have to understand what they are really about. We have to look to other things rather than her biography.
Right, right, yes. And the essay begins, thank you, Jocelyn, begins by questioning the cultural significance of the adjectives that are used to describe her work and describe her as her work. So for instance, American, woman, sculptor, African American, and Native American. How are these terms related to history and place? When we say American, what does that even mean in terms of history and place? Or even woman? So who could expand on that? Who could relate these adjectives, American, woman, sculptor, African American, and Native American, in terms of history and place? Who could get some examples on how it relates? Yes, Rusty.
Well, I mean, they're all relationships to power.
Mhm.
I mean, it's every single one of those is a description of a relationship to power as we understand it.
Right.
And so just that's just a start of where she ranks, you know, because all of those are just, yeah, to put someone in a box. That's what they all are
Right.
designed to do.
Right. And we could even link specific places in relation to these adjectives. For instance, American is an expression of citizenship. Woman is an expression of home and a distortion in terms of gender. Sculptor is referring to the 19th century tradition of men creating specific markers of power. African American, of course, is related to slavery and the relationship between free meaning with no cost, labor with no cost. And Native American is also related to the expansion of the United States to the West, and also it's connected to the idea of indigenous. So why did Lewis skew ethnological models? That's the question that we need to ask. And Jocelyn begin unpacking this. Why is she choosing? And of course, this is a loaded question because we will never know. Why did she do that? We don't know, and it doesn't even matter. But what is interesting is how she makes a difference between the female sculptures that she's making and the male sculptures that she's also making, because they're connected to each other. So how could we understand artistic agency in this sense? And in this question, I also want you to think about, why is autobiography relevant, specifically in terms of place and history?
It says that so I just wrote it down like word for word from the reading. To maintain authority over her voice, she had to authenticate her position as an objective observer and to safeguard her position and power as an artist. So kind of my takeaway was that if I mean, it's almost like she preemptively erased herself from the artwork because that was the only way she could keep her identity and have her art stand on its own. Which is why so she got to keep her artistic voice that way. That's, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And Mark is asking also a question in relation to Frida Kahlo, and I was actually reading on my notes, and I have this quote from the reading. Her very whiteness, in fact, symbolized the penetration of her body by the white master. A sympathetic figure, she existed between two worlds, but belonged to neither. The Indian woman, too, had to be cleansed of her identity to be acceptable. And this is also why Frida Kahlo is so successful, which has nothing or little to do with whatever intention she had. It is clear in Frida Kahlo's work that she did study art history. This idea of femininity and being naive is ridiculous because we can even trace how her images are rooted in colonial painting. But it is also how the Mexican government, the Mexican national identity, this idea of citizenship is using this double game where she didn't belong to neither of these worlds. Her father was German, her mother was Oaxacan. In the national narrative, it's claimed that she was indigenous. We don't know that because in Mexico, everyone is indigenous and nobody's indigenous. It is a complicated issue related more to class than actual race. So yes, and I think, let me see, Casey was asking another question. She refused to be victimized by her own hand. Yes, absolutely. And this is how we begin to unpack agency. Because just as Rusty said, and this is the quote that I took that as the most important one for us to remember, Louise remains a presence that is absent in her work. Louise remains a presence that is absent in her work. She is present as an artist, as the creator of art, but she's absent as the subject or object of her art. So when we create, we have to remain present as the artist, but not as the object of desire. Our work is about ourselves and never about ourselves. It's much more than how we embody. It has little to do with our biological features, and it has to do more with who we are. And who we are is never our national identity. We are much more than just the invention of identity, because identity is always being negotiated. And I always use the example of gender. Gender is not something we are, it's something we do. Same with race. Race is not something we are, it's something we do. And whenever artists are dealing with race, I always remind them, it doesn't matter what race they imagine, even whiteness, because whiteness is also very fragile. Whiteness is here, not in any other part. It's here. It's a relationship with power. Now, it does have an effect in how we experience reality. It does have an effect in how people are reading us. But remember, it says more about the reader than yourself, because we are much more than the body. So we have to keep in mind that in our work, we have to remain present as an artist, as the creator, but absent as the subject or object of desire. And this is why I also use object of desire, because the idea is not how we hide ourselves, because then, for instance, art would be impossible. From self-portrait to any single trait that we use to articulate our ideas. It is the idea of us being the object of desire for someone else that has to be not present in the work. Do you guys have any questions at this point?
Yeah, I have a question, and
Yes.
maybe it's a little bit silly, and you just touched on it briefly. But that idea of a presence that is absent in our work, and we have to remain present as the artist, but not as the subject of the work. You just touched on self-portraiture, but like Could you expand on that a little more? Like I'm thinking of like Cindy Sherman's self-portraits and how they're, how can you say that, but then there's still maybe works of self-portraiture that are out there?
Right. How we are present in the work is how we are able to perform with the viewer the reality that it was one perspective. It was a production of an image, and it's actually creating meaning in context. Because the self-portrait is not the artist, it's just an image. So it is making sure, and if you think about Monia Lewis, this is what she's doing. When you begin identifying these differences between men, between her female and male sculptures, you understand that she had a decision in the process. It's not reality, it's a commentary. And it's the same with self-portrait, because self-portraits are never us. It's just an image. So it is making the viewer aware that it's a process that is always being negotiated. And this is also how we're going to connect with the next reading, Notes on Rwanda Revisualized, because it is also tapping into the idea of genocide. And genocide is a very specific term that is used legally after World War II. We use it now frequently, but the scholar is also thinking about the impossibility of representing genocide. So what do we find in Notes on Rwanda Revisualized, Genocide, Photography, and the Area of Witness? And there are very interesting questions that the scholar is actually thinking about, because is it possible to be a witness? Is it possible to represent the horrors? Why do we want to represent the horrors or avoid them? What are all these implications? If the work, as we've been unpacking, is always celebrating the appropriation of labor, the extinction of the environment, and the extermination of people, genocide, or more than genocide, extermination, is always implicit in the work. Is it possible to represent it? What do you find in this reading? Who wants to go first?
Hey,
Christian.
as Kirsten was says on the other essay, has this the meaning of sculpture as the meaning of images, has this relationship between the viewer and witness, and how political discourse get into discussion. For example, is used for the use of images is used for intimidation and manipulation, and that's one of the meanings that can have the same photograph, but it's never going to be as a real like moment, because that's going to change depending of what the viewer becoming witness becomes, the text from that reading that he's making and the meaning that he's having from the image.
Right. So as Christian is saying, the meaning of the work will change as the viewer encounters the work. So when we think about witness in the context of this reading, what is the word or the concept witness actually performing? And this also relates to previous conversations about authenticity. So when I say authenticity and we start thinking about the concept of witness, what is actually being performed?
Is it examination and self-examination of how you interpret an image, or how you're examining what's being seen?
Yes. So when we think about witnessing, what is it actually performing? When we think about images of genocide in relation to events in history, and we say witness, what is it provoking in the mind of the viewer? more than the actual work, the word witnessing.
Can I go?
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi, Mariana.
Uh, I do believe that this work it's trying to make yourself like placing yourself in the reality that is being performed by the picture or the image.
Mm-hmm.
So it is like there is only one reality according to the image, and you are presencing it, even if you weren't there.
Yes, yes. And the scholar, thank you, Mariana. Yes, because even the scholar is arguing that the presence of photojournalists in the site of genocide was very restricted and very limited. Not many were actually able to be there physically. So, but many of the works and many of the actual visual production of those years, it's very much rooted in the idea of witnessing. And this is, as Mariana is explaining, gives authority. This authority of being the one who has the truth. This is also related to autobiography in the sense that Kirsten is actually challenging. It is how autobiography is also invented by art history, because it is not that the artist is claiming an autobiographical connection with the work, is how actually art history is framing the work. So authenticity and authority have that similar function to seduce, and more than seduce, to force us to believe that what we're seeing is real. And this also relates to the reading on the reality effect, the imaginary orient. So I pulled one of the quotes that is very important. Neither images of actual killings nor images of dead bodies explain the killings. Both often leave their audiences momentarily horrified but largely ignorant. Mhm. And this is how we connect with empathy. This is why empathy is so dangerous. This is why empathy, as Levinas frames it, is a pre-ethical state. And remember, through Ramon Grossfogel, we know that the meaning of words, because of the tradition of the 16th century, has been kidnapped. So even if we think we know what empathy means, it actually functions differently. And this is how it functions. It makes us momentarily horrified, but largely ignorant. And then it prevents the possibility of action. In the era of the witness, the public are often consumers of crisis and spectators to crisis, rather than being witnesses in the more ambitious sense of responsible ethical participant. And I pulled another quote from the reading on mobility. And this is from Levinas. In every death is shown the nearness of the neighbor and the responsibility of the survivor. And this is to expand the notion that our work doesn't have to be about genocide. You know, there are artists who choose and get obsessed with the specific problems. But it is what is actually in the work always is contact, which is what we think about as face-to-face encounter. Yes, and Victoria is asking about empathy. Do you mind expanding more on why empathy is dangerous? Do you think it can lead to responsibility in any cases? No, I don't think so. Because it is similar to hope. Hope makes you believe you're doing something when you're doing nothing. When we think about hope, and the perfect example is this residency, I don't have hope yet. Working with you guys sort of gave me the possibility to believe that something can change, which could be similar to the definition of hope, but it's actually about action. And when we think about empathy in terms of images, It makes you feel, so momentarily being horrified, but it keeps you largely ignorant. Yes, Daniela.
I had this conversation with a friend yesterday because she was talking about how she watched a video of a woman in Kenya who was cooking stones for her children because she had nothing else to offer since she couldn't go to work. And she said, do you make your children aware of what's happening in the world? And I said, yes. I said, but there is a difference between just making them aware to be, to feel and to notice that some people don't have something, and then raising them to be generous, to have action. I said, because sure, they could see all these images and feel bad, but then be very selfish and not have action to be kind and to be physically generous. So I said, and that's what I try to make them aware of. That not that, oh, the world is definitely not picture perfect painting. There are a lot of things that happen in the world, but it's what you do that makes the difference, not what you feel. Because we are bombarded by many images, and this is why I always say to my children that just because you see something and you feel something doesn't mean that you actually like empathy is putting you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes without action. So
yes, absolutely. Yes, because empathy is the first step to extermination. And this is not how we judge morally either the term or people who use the term. It is actually the possibility of expanding action. It's not that empathy is morally wrong. It is actually how we're seduced by modernity to imagine that we do more than what we actually do. And this is how we need to understand that intention, because it doesn't remain in the work, then empathy doesn't work. What we need to think about is agency, and agency is the capacity to react in context. And I pulled these two quotes that actually connect with what Daniela just explained. Images are recognizable if they appeal to the images that the viewers already carry with them as visual memories. But this form of contextualization also means that the new image is perceived in terms of other than its own. So it's not really what the image is about, it's actually how it's being perceived, and that's out of our control. And then we link it also with this idea. The idea that a photographic archive can adequately represent the aftermath of trauma, and therefore non-representable events such as 9/11, is intriguing. And the scholar uses Diana Taylor, and she's saying trauma is anti-archival by definition. And this is because we cannot feel the pain of others. We cannot. It doesn't mean we can't take action. It doesn't mean we don't feel, but we cannot feel the pain of others. There is an impossibility in anything to convey the pain of others. We can only convey how we see the world. It doesn't mean that it's how we are. So it's only one perspective and a process that is always in constant negotiation.
And the way we feel to somebody else's situation, it's like maybe we can relate because it happened to us, but we can definitely not feel what they're feeling because we might have dealt with it in a different way. That's what I always try to explain to my friends, that you can say, I'm sorry, I've lost my mother, but the way I lost my mother and the way you lost your mother might be different.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yes. And this is also how we connected with this question. What it is that art itself does that gives rise to a way of thinking and feeling about trauma, but it's actually about anything. And this is how we also contest what I always say, that art is against us. It's true. Art is against us. However, also art has that possibility to give rise to a way of thinking and feeling and questioning that, which is what we're interested in. We will never solve the problem of genocide through images, and also because it is connected to a gallery system and a museum system, and all of that is about profit. So that even puts into question how artists produce their work. However, what we see is that art is very powerful, and therefore it has that possibility to question how the viewer will encounter, how the viewer will think about specific problems. And Mark is asking, can image be combined with visual representations of word to guide away from empathy or for to communication with? I don't think it's about, we can't control images, and images are also text. And what we need to think about is how it is connected to a specific tradition in terms of the technique. That is what we can work with, because the tradition of the technique, how it's been used in relation to power, it's already set. Therefore, if we study the rules of the agency of the work, then we can actually begin using those same tools. Tools is the wrong word, but we can actually start using the technique to perform a question, to make the viewer perform an open-ended question. So now we're going to connect. Do you guys have any other questions at this point?
Well, not necessarily a question, but one of the things that I struggled with in this article was that, you know, many images of genocide and the related artworks, not the one with the eyes, but some of the other ones, a lot of the way we, how should I say this? A lot of times photography performs as theater. And, you know, this article does mention the history of what, you know, when you're talking about what people accept, you know, they're saying, oh, you know, this conflict is really ancient between, you know, the Hutus and Tutsis, but it was really, you know, a government sanctioned movement. However, you know, a lot of times when I couldn't help but read this article and think about, you know, not just images of genocide, but like in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, how it was permissible to use these really horrific images of Black bodies that had died. When I think about how police shooting videos go viral, and so like there's this shadow of that work that is, you know, kind of tied to this legacy of hegemony and colonialism. And so in that way, it really, to me, it prevents empathy. I think it connects to people being used to seeing, you know, National Geographics and, you know, here is the savage with her breasts out, which is very much the way, you know, I don't think that that idea changes for people. And when they're talking about the aestheticization of violence with the images of the children of rape who, you know, that came out of that, you know, that it's all problematic. So that was kind of what I got out of that reading. I'm not sure it's what we were supposed to get out of it.
No, it is actually very useful because I also was very skeptical. I really like the work of Alfred Jar because it's also used in different instances to understand how there is an impossibility to represent. And that's what I find useful. The other two photographers were a little bit iffy because it is also, as you're explaining, rooted in the invention of Africa and how videos in the 80s and even, you know, We Are the World. And there's a really interesting documentary on YouTube, I'll find it for you guys, that explains how Africa was invented as a place where empathy is performed through charity and how it actually flows into the specific relationships with power. That's another question. And however, what I found interesting and important in the reading is how neither images of actual killings nor images of dead bodies explain the killings. And it's precisely how you're asking the question. When we think about Hurricane Katrina and how empathy sometimes function or not, Usually it's caricature or empathy, and they work depending on the audience. This is always about citizenship. How we read the images, for instance, of Hurricane Katrina, or even the genocide in Rwanda, has to do with citizenship, and has to do with public and private, and has to do with how we are morally exercising a position in terms of power. And it's again how we have invented this idea of place and history, and how we exist in time or we exist in place. And none of those two possibilities actually will change anything. And this is how we need to think about images as an impossibility to represent. This is why we treat them not as an expression of reality, but as an open-ended question. It is how we deal with it, because all images have a legacy. All images have the burden of art history and art in general. They cannot be separated. And this is not how we point at fingers, because if you think about it, what we're doing is decentering, if we could use a word. It's knowing that there's no Europe, there's no Americas. There's no colonizer colonized. We have all been colonized. We are all colonized subjects. However, in any way that we imagine ourselves, because we always play within these two positions, place or time, as the idea of controlling time, through gender, through race, through class, none of those two ends will be exempt from extermination. None of them. It is this idea that because of privilege, we will be exempt and we have a responsibility to give back. That's not true. It's the reality of the contact that matters. And that's another word that I want to introduce. It's not only encounter in this idea of the America and Europe and how they encounter each other. No, it's actually how contact creates friction. And this is how I want to introduce reading The Erotic Life of Racism. And there's an anecdote in the beginning that frames the whole context that we're talking about, and even the book. So who wants to introduce this anecdote? And the book is by Sharon Holland.
I can do that. So the
Yes.
anecdote is about a woman and her child listening to Tupac in their car at a grocery. It's like at a grocery store, I believe, and how a white woman wants her to move her car so that she can load the groceries in a particular side instead of using the other side, which is not blocked at all. And how the author of this piece says, "I'll be happy to wait in my car until you're finished." And she sits and continues spending time with her daughter, listening to Tupac. And then as the woman is done loading the groceries, the author and her daughter get out of the car to go into the store. And as she passes the woman says, "And to think I marched for you." And then the author decides, like, I can either continue walking and say nothing, or I can confront this person and provide an example to my daughter. So she turns and she says something like, "You didn't march for me, you marched for yourself. And if you can't see that, I can't help you."
How does that relate to place? How could we explain time and space versus place and history? Thank you, Taylor.
Yes.
Jesse.
Hey. I felt like that related to place because again, it like the whole "and to think I marched for you," it shoves her back into that like same. It creates history and place because it pushes her back into that same history and says, you will never evolve beyond this, like the poor Black person who white people came to rescue. And the whole like, "and to think I marched for you," she's basically saying, I marched for you. She marched for herself because she thinks she marched for this person, but actually she still wants this person to behave how she wants her to. Sorry, I'm not speaking very well today, but yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
it usually it also implies mobility. It was about forcing her to physically move.
Yeah.
That's how place is invented. It's in relation to citizenship, it's in relation to gender, it's in relation to race, it's in relation to class. All of these problems or all of these hateful ways of organizing coincide. And I'm sure all of us have experienced moments in which we are forced to be in place in the past. And I always use an example to rethink how nobody is exempt from the problem. And I used it in the essay on mobility. We had this scholar who grew up in the United States, and she is from a Salvadorian family. We asked her to teach a seminar on decolonization. And in the process of asking questions, because the problem with race is that it doesn't function outside of place. So in Mexico, it doesn't function. It doesn't mean people can't be racist. It doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. But class, it's even more strict, more dangerous, more hateful than race, at least in the context of Mexico. And race and class always operate together because they latch onto each other. And the example that I use is to understand that as we were having these conversations, students were aware of class. And they were asking questions about class because in Mexico, you're born within your class and you die within your class. There's very little mobility. We even invented universities for classes. So you go only to the universities where you belong within your class. And if you dare to go to a university that doesn't belong to your class, you get a scholarship. Hopefully you'll finish, but most of the time you will not finish the program. You'll not complete the program. Everything is organized spatially. So when you go to downtown, only specific people go downtown and other people go to other places. We do not mix. And the problem is that we don't even have the language of class. We don't even talk about it. We are set in our ways and we think it's okay. So what happens is that this scholar is bringing all these questions that are triggering all these anxieties, which is normal and necessary within this program. And one of the students is asking, one of the artists in residence is asking, what about class? How do we deal with class in Mexico? And she immediately responds with this notion of how she's always being confused with being Mexican in the United States, and she's irritated by that. And not only that, she puts it in her words, she says, I have a history. So this is again how we play space-time, plays history. And she says, I have a history. And in my mind, and also because Nayeli was present in that session, we both were like, she would never get confused by Mexican. Because by class, she would never be confused by Mexican. It's very clear to us. And that's the dangerous way in which, and also to students whose idea of Mexico as Mexicans as a race includes everything that is Latino. They couldn't distinguish the difference between, so what would be the problem to be called Mexican or not Mexican? Because it's also a hateful statement. Don't call me Mexican because I'm not Mexican. And in our mind, when we bring a scholar from the United States, and not necessarily mine or Nayeli's, but in the context of Mexico, race doesn't mean anything. So even artists who identify as African American are perceived as white because of privilege, because of class. So it is this very dangerous place that was invented in that moment, in which she thought of herself as more than Mexican. We saw her as white, but also less than Mexican. And then students were also racializing her to not necessarily have any distinctions between Latino, Mexican, or Central American as one race. So we see how these places that we imagine we play, we were all being hateful to each other without even thinking about it. Through class, through gender, through race. So this is a game that nobody wins. This is why the only possibility is to understand contact, meaning when we encounter, there's movement, there's space and time, and everything can be negotiated to a certain extent, of course. But what I'm trying to say is it is the only space and time that has not been colonized yet. This is also how we understand that the world as we know it is it's flawed, it's failing. Therefore, the answer is not in democracy. The answer is not in marching. The answer is not, and I'm not saying that we're against that. What I'm saying is we have to embrace the responsibility of friction, knowing that when we're touched, we're changed, to understand what that means, and that as a possibility to extend that to our practice. Yes, Taylor.
So this would be taking the word contact or encounter quite literally. So I understand that there's also a metaphorical contact going on as well. But I was curious how, if you would speak to these days where everybody, it's like isolate, quarantine, where experiencing social distancing is the term, and how contact performs within that.
Right, right. Remember that the only two realities that we can embrace are that we are alone, and it's so true that now we are all alone. Even if we're confined with somebody else, we're alone because we are experiencing isolation very differently. And the second reality that I always think about is that we're dying. So much so that the fear of dying forces us to be confined. Those are the only two realities. And that means that contact is beyond place. Contact is not real in the sense of physical contact, but as a possibility of seeing each other in time and space. And I'll give you an example. When you read Sharon Holland, you don't need to have her in her presence in front of you telling you the story. You're having a contact with her, and that rubbing moved you in a way that place and history is being rethought. And then you also have to think about time and space. And this is how I also relate it to our work. Just like with the readings, just like with the essays and the scholars that we're having these encounters, these contacts, this is what will happen with our work. Our work will outlive us. And that means somebody will encounter the work. And that's a possibility to correct time and space and challenge place and history. So the word contact and the word encounter is a physical way of encountering. Of course, it is connected, but it's more to understand that it's beyond how we embody, and it's actually as to understand the possibility that we have to see each other beyond the body. Yes, somebody had a question or a comment.
I was going to say thanks. That example was like made it very clear for me.
Okay. Yes. Any other questions? Any other comments at this point?
I have a question.
Yes, Camila.
I'm thinking about sort of like the granting system in Canada for like arts, like money in the arts, basically. And a lot of these applications ask you to self-identify, and that process, like sometimes doing that allows you to have access to more money.
Right.
But at the same time, it like forces you to confine to the idea of like what has been placed on you. Like if you're a woman, or if you're Latina, or if you're like not born in Canada, etc., and like how that becomes a way to access money that you might not access unless you self-identify.
Right.
I don't know. Like, I don't really know what I'm asking, but I think all these conversations are like making me think about that, and I guess like how problematic that is. And yeah, it's frustrating.
Well, it's a very good question, non-question, because it is an experience that, uh, this is not how we morally judge anyone. And the lesson that I've learned through the years, because the reason why, we've been talking about change, and we've been thinking about change for at least 10 years. And as we encounter each other, we've been working together for this change, and then suddenly change happens in the most horrific way. Could be worse, but it is happening in a horrific way, right? The reality is that Arquetopia cannot apply for any of those grants for multiple reasons. We're not a museum, we're not a school, we're not a hotel, we're not really a business. So it is this complicated place in which we are situated, but this is what we created for ourselves. And we are taking it with pride, and the reality that we need to continue working together with our communities. So what I'm trying to say is that eventually we have to figure out what sustainability means. I'm not saying you shouldn't apply for the grants. I'm not saying you should apply for the grants. Uh, but it's a reality that we have to face, and we also have to pick our battles. Maybe the grant will allow you to take a step for that sustainability. In the early years of Arquetopia, we had to take one or two tiny grants that eventually gave us a possibility. It is what it is. You cannot just detach from the world. But we have to pick our battles. And I'll give another example that might seem silly. And this usually happens with artists or citizens of Germany or Austria. Every time I encounter them, every time, hasn't been an exception, every single time. And that happened to me in Iran, and that happened to me in Europe, and that has happened to me in Mexico. Every time I encounter Germans or Austrians, and this is nothing against them, it's just how things have evolved. I'm always the first, within the first minutes of a conversation, they would say to me, "Wow, your English is very good." And because of my class and how I was raised, the first response I would say is, "Thank you, blah blah blah. I went to these schools," or whatever, trying to be polite, right? As we know, and as have we read about racism, this is a way to put me in place as a past, the past as a place, to as opposed to recognize the reality of the encounter. So what I do now is I respond immediately and I say, "Well, your English is not that good, but I can still understand you." And that brings back the notion, and they're always confused, always confused. "Oh yeah, well, my school, blah blah blah, I didn't learn it that well." But see, that makes me again present in the same time, in the same moment. That doesn't mean I'm going to be fighting with everyone, but these are the little pleasures that I can take on rethinking time and space. This is how we correct it. This is, and sometimes when the burden is too heavy, we just have to give it back, at least half of it. It is a similar moment to what Taylor was explaining in terms of sharing in the parking lot. How we correct it to understand that place is a vicious, horrific way of framing ourselves. So with all of this in mind, let's start thinking about artistic agency. And I want you guys to start sharing what you're thinking about in terms of your practice. What are you up to at this point? And I know that as we are getting closer to the opening of the world, we are starting to get more busy. So it's also thinking about process, not necessarily what we have done physically. Yes, Mariana, go ahead.
Honestly, for me, it has raised more questions, even more questions than the previous questions that I already have. Because I mean, I think now that I'm walking through like a rocky road in terms of, like, for example, in here, they have like make the quarantine last until the end of May. But I'm trying to fight against this idea of not being able to going outside to get stuff to do things.
Hmm.
So that's, for example, one thing that I have been trying to work with in terms that I do not have any materials to do anything. I just bought like some thread and fabric, and I'm trying to work with that. But also another thing that is happening to me is like I'm been thinking all the time about me being located here and not in Mexico. And that changes a lot of things like in my perception because I am trying to perceive myself like taking myself outside the academic world in terms of I'm not here to do like the PhD interviews, like trying to put myself in a different place,
Hmm.
and it is challenging me. But I think that this process has been like transforming me more in terms of like what can I do to be or to how do I do not perform as someone with power or someone with more knowledge in quotation marks, talking in the like in the academic world, because usually we are seen as someone that has like a different status.
Right.
um, so it's yeah, I'm navigating through those ideas right now.
Yes. Could you expand a little bit on what do you mean when you say I don't want to perform someone with power? What does that
I
mean?
think that I have been struggling with this idea of like trying to write, like finishing my PhD
Hmm.
without placing myself or letting people placing myself as someone that is doing a PhD. And that because I do believe that this tension and this process of like the objectivizing the ideas that I have or the academic things that I have to write,
Hmm.
it's really hard. It has been really, really, really hard because you usually think, or the academy makes you think that you are always telling the truth and what you're writing is something that is objective and something that is the reality when you are like here or me that I'm here, you are seeing a completely different reality, or your perception of the things that are happening are different, and the people that is perceiving you in this context is different. So that's something that has been making my mind blow.
Right. Yes. Well, the first
Mhm.
thing that we need to think about that I can recommend is to understand that it is impossible to strip privilege from yourself. It is impossible, and romanticizing that idea it's dangerous because it makes us not see our shadow.
Yes.
So the question here is what you do with privilege, not how you strip yourself from power. It's also not
Mm.
implying that there's no responsibility with power and that you don't have to question it. It's perfect that you're questioning it, and it's
Yes.
more about what you do with it than trying to figure out how not to reenact
Mm.
that relationship. And there are two other ideas that I think are necessary to address. The first one is that in the idea of progress, in the narrative of progress, is that we are being placed to perform productivity. And this is why we have to be making and we don't
Mhm.
have the necessary materials and we're confined. So how do I do it? The work that we're doing here today and that we've been doing together and also separately uh, is a work that will make sense after the residency. It's not about place and history. It's you're actually doing the work. The moment you're starting to think about the shadow is the moment that you're actually
Mm.
dealing with the shadow, even if you don't have any solution for it. So the first thing is to relax and know that sometimes even sleeping is necessary to process ideas. It's true. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Okay, how am I
Of
going to
course.
make all of this if I have to think about genocide and extermination and now Rwanda is haunting me and now I have these eyes? It's impossible, right? Now, the other thing that I always try to force artists to think about is class. How do we perform class? Because we are usually aware how we perform gender and how we perform race. And in Latin America, specifically when we think about Bolivia and Mexico, there is a class tension that is real, well, real, quote unquote, that is invented, that is necessary for citizenship to be performed. So how do we perform citizenship has to do with class. And if it's clear, and the example that is usually clear to me is gender is not something we are, it's something we do. So if I do my gender, I also have to understand that as I'm doing gender is always contingent to class. So the biggest question is, how am I doing class? How am I performing class? Not to figure out how not to perform it, but to understand what agency means, the capacity to react in context. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just giving you more questions, but it is a possibility to reimagine how we can deal with that. Thank you, Maria.
Of course, and I do know that also that path, the path of romanticizing this idea of not getting, like being powerless in quotations, is something that is not going to happen. Never, never, never. So yeah, that's it.
Yes, I think what we need to think about is what do you do with your PhD that is going to matter? Because also the process of finishing the PhD is something necessary that you cannot avoid. So it is what you do with it, what will matter.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else wants to share challenges? Because
so our,
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So our readings got me kind of interested in the museum's relationship to power and legitimacy and whatever. So I've kind of so the readings that we had with the problematics of collecting and display, I devoured all of that because I kind of I'm starting to work on a story about a really grand museum that is just the crap of a family, but presented in the way of things in a museum, because I think there's a way to tell the story there. Anyway, that's kind of, but there's like so much philosophical bedrock there that is like it's going to be I don't know, it's like it's going to be fun to dig in and ask questions with that. So that's I've been a little bit inspired. So
yes. The first thing is that we're using the museum as an example of how vicious institutions are. And that includes universities, and that includes families, and that includes homes, and that includes hospitals and jails, and it goes on and on and on. So it doesn't mean that we can live outside of institutions. It's a reality that we engage with them. What I find really interesting in the project that you're thinking about is that crap is a word that refers to class. So how do you invent the place of class and how it's being performed will be key to the story, to the process, to the narrative. Because it's not the history only of the museum where, all these things were stolen from people, and now it is actually the process of industrialization and how these objects that were stolen created the imagination, the fantasy of a visual culture that eventually becomes all these collected crap. So you need to unpack crap. What does that even mean in relation to who will see the museum, who thinks about the museum, who talks about the museum in your story? And that's, again, how do we do class? How do we perform class? And Jocelyn had a question about, thank you, Rusty. How long will we have access to the video recordings? They're actually on YouTube, so we will have access to them forever. and we've been editing them and uploading them as soon as we can. I completed the third. We completed the third editing. Thank you, Tonali, for that. And the fourth will be uploaded by the end of today so that you have access to it. What other questions in terms of practice, agency, challenges that we're facing at this point?
Hear me?
Hello, Francisco. Oh, sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. This is Karina.
Mhm.
So I have been working recently with a lot of text, or I want to say like language within my work. So I believe the biggest challenge, and I kind of related to like Imagines Communities reading, on the sense how language is also associated with power in the sense of like nationalism, right? And I was kind of thinking on like when I was how I work with text and how I work with this type of images is that I want to express the, I guess, or at least question the idea of the about what is it meant to be of one community or another. Like how would I even, it's like the imagination of community and how that relates to language, and how language is somewhat imposed onto others, and how it may, I want to say, reinforce either the lack of reinforced structures of power or or I guess disadvantages of others. So I guess I want to start saying is that that's what I've been challenging myself with. I've been focusing a lot on like looking at census papers and like documentation of like communities here within the United States, and how there's like this broad generalization of like communities here, like you have to pick either you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic, either again with the idea of some other race, and how these forms of languages kind of like push these like these structures of power. So I think I've been working with that, but also it's just the challenge is how do you question that language even further? How do you push it more?
Yes, it's a wonderful question, because remember that colonization is not just something that happened to someone else. It's not just an imposition by someone to another one. It's always a process of negotiation. And this is why class, again, is so relevant. How colonization happened in the Americas, and we see it in the two most studied examples, Peru and Mexico. The class alliances that happened were necessary for empire to prevail. And this is when the narrative becomes invented. Mexico claims that Spain came, destroyed, conquered, and then the nation, emerge from the ashes into the future, blah, blah, blah. No, the reality is that in collusion, higher classes with higher classes that came from Spain and other places created a system that still prevails today. So language is ideal for that, because language is always showing that negotiation. How, for instance, Spanish in Mexico is very different from Spanish in Spain, speaks about power. Not identity, speaks about power, speaks about this idea of nobility, how we understand that we descend from noble families of the indigenous universe, whatever that means, and also European universe. How it doesn't deny the reality that there's always this negotiation in the scale of power when we think about language. But this is also, for instance, how taste transform Europe. And what scholars have been looking at in recent years, in probably in the last 20 years of rethinking art history, is that the technology and the knowledge that emerged from the Americas not only gave the resources and the possibility for the Renaissance to happen, it was actually so powerful that it renegotiated power relationships. So much so that chocolate invaded the world. So much so that tomato, all these, and there's wonderful narratives. I have a few readings that I will include. Let me keep track of them so that you can actually start unpacking that, how taste it transformed. Because one of the interesting things about taste is that as we imagine by class, that we classify, I like this, but I don't like this, and this is more refined, and this is not. In fact, what we classify is classifying us. This is why class is so dangerous, because it makes us imagine that it's natural and organized in a very specific way, and that we are superior, blah, blah, blah. What we need to understand is how language is always being negotiated. So what you'll find in language is not only the superimposition, it's actually the possibility of certain ways of understanding the world to prevail and contest power. Another example that I always think about is, for instance, paella. Paella is a national dish, and of course it is a product of extermination in Spain, but it was so powerful that it could not be erased. Same as chocolate. There's also examples in architecture, there's examples in literature, there's all these ways of reading that were actually a possibility to contest power. So yes, knowledge is never just one. Within the superimposition of knowledge, think about class, and within that you will start seeing different ways in which power was negotiated and keeps being negotiated.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. And this is another tip that I'm giving you. And this relates to the question that Camila was asking. Any projects about nationalism will be funded. We're going back to a similar place, but very different at the same time, as the beginning of the 20th century. Any projects about nationalism will be funded because they will be necessary to reorganize place. How we deal with identity, I would suggest to think about citizenship. How we perform citizenship and who has access to citizenship, so that we don't fall in the traps of I'm Latino, and sometimes you just have to put it in the grant because otherwise you won't get it. That's something that you'll have to come to terms with, but try to frame it in terms of citizenship as opposed to identity.
Okay, citizenship. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe bring something up that I've been working on a little bit, just to, I don't know, talk through it. I've been doing this thing that I just am calling screenshots of power, if you will. But anytime on Instagram, or mostly on Instagram, when I see a photo of like Mickey Mouse or the Coca-Cola logo or a tire or something like that that I kind of associate with power, I'll take a screenshot of it. And then I've taken that kind of body of work so far and zoomed in on that specific thing, like to the point where it's very pixelated and almost like unrecognizable. So it's just a very small portion of that logo or that Mickey Mouse photo. And then I've been like projecting it on the wall and redrawing it. And I'm playing around with those concepts that you were talking about of correcting time and space and distortion. But just wanted to get your thoughts on how that kind of relates to time and space correction and distortion, and if there's anything to be said about that in that work at all.
Yes, it's a wonderful project. It's the beginning, because what I would suggest you to do is to start investigating place in relation to each one of those images. So for instance, when we think about Coca-Cola, it's related to pharmacy as a place. So to connect the history of sugar to the process of extermination of people, it's incredible. And from there, you can go into the history of medicine, and it can take you to candy, to processed food. It can go into many interesting directions. When we think about Mickey Mouse, that's a racist stereotype. It is rooted in thinking about African Americans as clowns. So it is how Mickey Mouse represented a place and eventually invented a place, Disneyland. So investigate place. For every single shot that you screenshot that you find, investigate place. Because then you're going to find a lot of resources to understand. And from there, you can start thinking about, for instance, maps. The map of Disneyland, the map of the pharmacy, the map of the hospital, the blueprint of the building. From there, it can take you into many interesting directions. Not necessarily that you have to address the image as the subject of the work, but as the rules in which the image is being read. So this idea of how you distort it to make it almost impossible to be read, it's interesting when you connect it to the history of place and the technology of inventing that place.
Thank you.
Mark Harris is asking, I'm working on reimagining myself as a resistor. What that does to class and place is really strange. In my practice, I've been working on taking images and ripping them so that they are no longer passports to specific place and perhaps open space for being something other. Mark, could you elaborate a little bit on the images that you are using? Why do you imagine yourself as a resistor? Resisting what? In what sense? And if you can turn on your microphone, that would be ideal. Mark, are you there? Okay. Well,
Okay,
Mark,
here I am. Sorry. It took a moment. It took a moment to find it. I've been doing a number of wood cuts or lino cuts that have involved faces or bodies, including a rather instructive one where I took a photograph of myself at age almost 80, naked in front of a mirror, and did a lino cut of it. And that was useful from a kind of a personal perspective to sort of get a sense of what am I reading into who I am as a dumpy old man. But in doing so, I sort of, I did that, and it was an exercise, and I came to a close. That was it. Meanwhile, the world with the pandemic and how people want to treat that as a war has turned me into part of the cannon fodder for that war. That is to say, I'm old and likely to be one of the people who gets offered up for the recovery of the economy. And I thought, wait a minute, I've been volunteered. I've been volunteered for this army fighting this war against the virus, and I wasn't even asked. That makes me a draftee. And it turns out that actually I'm fairly resistant to that. So I suddenly realized, no, I'm being kind of a draft resistor, right? Okay, all of that stuff is going on. And then I have followed a number of really interesting artists who tear paper into pieces. And I was excited to see today that Sarah Zipling tears pieces of paper into pieces and reformats how they're used against other backgrounds. And I thought, right, to some extent, what I'm interested in doing is tearing apart these images, which were kind of passports to kind of settle places, however I was settling them. And now I can take those and in ripping them up, destroy what their initial what I thought they were carrying initially as meaning, and now can put them together in some other configuration to find new surprising possibilities there. That's the project.
Yes.
That's sort of, it's interesting. It's kind of come together in the last week in the sense of getting a sense that it's not enough for me to do the liner cuts per se and to print those, but in fact to use those kind of, what was I trying to do first, and now ripping that up enough so that I can get open spaces in that to do something new. So that's what's going on.
Yes, it's a wonderful question for because it opens many interesting concepts. The first one is how we have a relationship with citizenship that we need to explore. As you're saying, as we age, as we are productive or non-productive, as we retire, as we teach, as we study, we have a relationship with citizenship that is connected to images. So the challenge here is how we actually, and actually the idea is, how do we challenge place? How do we represent a non-place? And maybe this is also connected with the history of money. How these images, as you were describing, of a specific men create faith in a place that we reassure who we are in a relationship to power. Because lino cuts are actually connected to the technology of printing money. They're also connected to the idea of place. They were used to print maps. So this possibility of destroying is only the first step. Right. How do you represent non-place? How do you imagine a non-place to again think about history? And I think this idea of how citizenship is what you're resisting, how you're challenging citizenship because you're being forced to be offered, but also what other aspects of citizenship you can actually challenge. It's not only what is threatening you, but it's other things that could be threatening to other people. So how do you challenge all of that? And specifically thinking about for profit, because if you think about it, when we have to be offered as citizenships for something, it's because we're no longer profitable. Even when we die, we have to be profitable.
Good luck.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Other questions, other comments at this point? Yes, Daniela.
Okay, I have a comment. I've been working on the project about violence against women, but so the idea is to have the women conceal their identities by putting something over their head. Anyway, so one thing, like I'm always open to go with the flow, is what I say. And so my friend, she showed me. She said, "Well, I'm not very comfortable with putting a bag over my head or a pillowcase over my head because of the images that evokes for her, like the history." And so, but she showed, I said, the idea is you pick the object, not me. You pick what you feel comfortable with putting over your head, whether it be something related to your family or yourself or whatever. But then she showed me, so she showed me this, because my friend is electromagnetic sensitive. So she showed me that she's gonna put the thing that she wears to the grocery store. And then I've worked with her on other photographs, and I asked her, I said, I couldn't stop thinking about your object and how strong, how right now we're at home and we're in isolation and we're conforming to the idea that we have to be connected. Like it wasn't a choice. I didn't say to the school, "I'm sorry, I don't agree with my son doing online classes." Like, and what this means for people who are electromagnetic sensitive, like the idea that everybody's at home in their building and now they're being more exposed. And so like her, for instance, she has the sensibility. Now everybody around her is at home and they're working from home. And so I said, is it okay if I do a side project about what it means and why we don't even know the dangers of it, but we have to just accept it. Like we have to conform to the idea that they're going to give us 5G, and many other places already have it. And what this does to our health is, well, it doesn't matter because it's about modernity. It's about moving forward and making money and all of that. And so,
Right. This is a wonderful project because what you need to think about women is the same way in which you're thinking about G5.
Yeah,
What
exactly.
makes it a woman? Because it's an invention.
Right.
And remember that women are only being killed through class.
Through class.
I'm simplifying, not necessarily only. But remember that how women experience oppression, it's more about class than actually gender. And this is why usually it fails. These movements of changing and pressuring usually fail because women have more in common with their oppressors than actually women themselves. So when you think about the objects that they're picking, it reveals the problem of class. Because what are the objects that each one of us is going to choose has to do actually with class more than gender. So what I would unpack is what it means in terms of class, because gender is a very vicious distortion that is rooted in nationalism that found its way into the core of the institution that we respect, that is family. And if you think about it, every single display of family emotions, public display, is bringing into the place the nation. You should not do this because it's dangerous. You should not do that because you shouldn't. It's morally wrong. It's the nation putting you in place, or me or whoever. So what we need to think about is how we perform class. How class is the problem. I always think that we always see that there are conversations about race and gender happening. Usually there's never a conversation about class. And this is because capitalism is invested in maintaining that order for profit. So thinking about class, to me, is a space, it's the place in which change could actually happen to turn it back to space. So think about how they perform class more than gender. Because remember, that would also open the project to understand that how we identify our allies has nothing to do with the body. You can find allies in very unexpected bodies. You suddenly realize that you have a connection with someone, regardless of gender or race or class, that gets you. Doesn't mean you have the same experience, but the person gets you.
It's a spark. Yeah.
Right. And to limit the project to gender will create an impossibility for that spark to happen within your project.
Well,
and
that's
remember,
why the idea was not to limit it to gender. For the first project, which was the violence against women, I didn't want to limit it to gender because I also don't want to be labeled as a feminist. I don't want to be put in I don't want the work to be put into grouped into some kind of this work is about feminism. This work is about so I do want later we'll include some men. It's harder to get men to volunteer, but I have a few. But with the project about the sensibility to the magnetic, I forget what I'm losing my words right now because I did a lot of work today. But I don't know how to address something that a lot of people see as being crazy. Like, so when she walks through the town and she's wearing her protective netting, it's like it helps so that the magnetic waves don't penetrate her head. I mean, people look at her like she's crazy. And then when you talk about this to other people, they're like, oh no, there's no such thing as being sensitive or getting ill from the magnetic waves. And I know the question is, how do I bring that up and how do I address that without it just being her problem?
yes,
you know?
yes, this is connected to place. Place, because what is normal and abnormal is place. What organizes who's healthy and who's not is place. So look into the history of medicine. Look into the history of devices, because there's a very visual history of torturous devices that were used to organize who's healthy and who's not. And that's going to open a lot of conversations about how crazy is actually a place. This is why they see her as a place. She's crazy, they put her in a place. So to unpack place in that sense is ideal.
Okay.
Thank you, Daniela.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Other questions at this point?
I had a comment, if that's okay. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what I've been working on at the moment. And I've been really interested in like exploring a lot of the themes that we're going over, and sort of how behind that, looking at how essentially we're exploring like mental patterns that we all have and the constructs that are there and the layers of conditioning that exist, and thinking a little bit about the way that the mind works and these mental patterns that we develop. And through my work, looking at patterns themselves. And one of the readings that really struck me was one of the first ones, the techniques of the observer, and the idea of the persistence of it, and how some images have a lasting effect, and how visuals can affect the way that the mind sort of operates, I suppose, and how patterns and visuals can affect mental patterns, and that link. So instead of working towards a project, I've been looking a lot at the technique and how realizing that when I'm really focusing on constructing an image, that image is, there's a residue of that image on myself, you know, sort of when you close your eyes, you've been focusing on something a lot, you see that pattern still. So kind of exploring that and diving into technique rather than product. And sort of observing the way that the process of creating art will affect my own mental state and their own sort of conditioning or sort of mental patterns that exist there. And that's really like where I am still. I've been looking a lot at Persian geometry or Islamic geometry as a starting point, just because it's something that I've been exposed to a lot. But noticing that with repetition, the distortion starts to come in, and allowing that to happen as organically as possible. But that's kind of where I am at the moment. I don't think that's where I want to end up, but you kind of have to start somewhere. But I'd be interested to hear any thoughts you have on it.
Yes. What I would suggest is we have to think about how memory is also connected to locality. And I think the reading on Rwanda also talks about that. And this also connects with Mark's question and my answer. The idea of creating a non-place, of not creating, of representing a non-place. Because what is useful about your process in that sense is to understand that it's one perspective. It's not reality. It's not science. It is connected to the way we understand visual culture today. So I would also look at that reading again, how the choices in the technology that creates images has rendered the idea of reality that is also false. It's invented. The way we read has to do with how we have been trained to read books in specific order. And I would also connect it with what you just said about other ways of reading. There are other cultures that read books in different ways. There are other cultures that read architecture in different ways. So that possibility of understanding the patterns is a possibility to understand and counter, but not through science. It's a possibility to connect, to create an open-ended question. So how do you represent a non-place and also allow the viewer to have an open-ended question in that sense? Yes.
And So the reason that I was also interested in like Islamic geometry a lot is because of the idea that it starts all from a single point and the whole pattern sort of expands from there. Like the point creates a circle and then the circle is divided and it kind of extrapolates.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sort of aware that by kind of sticking to that like discipline, that that the work is kind of centered in that, you know, in the history and the background of that area. Like, do you have any sort of comments on that?
Yes, I have a read. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to finish. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say I don't want to get into the realms of like cultural appropriation or sort of, you know, I'm just a bit aware of that sort of like balancing, like treading that sort of line, I guess.
Right, right. And this is a very important question because I don't believe in cultural appropriation. I think it's a trend that only invents plays even more. It's not that anyone will get offended by cultural appropriation. The problem is that we reenact process of extermination. So it's not cultural appropriation, it's actually extermination what is happening. And what we need to think about whenever we find ideas that we think do not belong to our culture is, are we seeking authenticity? Are we seeking controlling time and putting people in place? Or are we seeking knowledge? So what I always suggest is to treat these forms, these expressions as they are, as knowledge, not as magical, not as colorful, not as Christian, not as Islamic, not as Mexican, not using any adjective that is related to place and history. And I have a really interesting reading that I've used before that talks about geometry, precisely challenging the idea of the one perspective, one point perspective. Because with geometry, and it talks about time and space as a possibility where it can be read in different ways. And I will send it. I will also, I'm writing it here so that I can upload it in the chapter so that you can actually access it. And it's not, and I always use this example. For instance, do the alphabet belong to the Mexican culture? No. We inherit this through Europe, and this also was inherited through the Islamic world. Is it cultural appropriation? Maybe, but it's not about reenacting genocide. It's about the possibility of knowledge. And knowledge is always a negotiation of power. So how we use that technology, that process, is what matters. It's not the image in itself, it's the process what matters. And this is again another suggestion, how we focus on the production of process, not in the production of images. If we are set on aesthetics, on the way things look, it's the wrong goal. It's not the wrong in the sense that we're not actually addressing what we want to address as an open-ended question. We're actually creating a statement about place and history. So we need to treat it as knowledge. A lot of conversations, for instance, about magic are similar. Magic is only labeled as magic because through the perspective of scientific knowledge, that is, of course, referencing to place, is diminishing the knowledge that many communities, including women in these communities, produce through the history, through history in general. And this is why, this is how witches were invented, and they were labeled to invoke, place and history. So it is how we treat that knowledge what matters. It is how we focus on process more than the actual image.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think Jocelyn, or who had a question? Let me see. Does anyone, or you, Francisco, have readings? This is Anna on embodied knowledge, or I know Anne Hamilton is an article that explores the concept. I'm not sure it's possible to embody knowledge because nothing can remain in any body. Knowledge is produced through friction, and meaning is always taking place, happening intersubjectively, meaning we agree on the meaning and then it happens. So if you can elaborate on the question, Anna, in what sense you're, because sometimes we get lost in terminology. Of course, academics are always coining new trendy terms so that we ignore the past and they get successful. So what do you mean by embodying knowledge? Do you have an example? Do you have an idea? How are you addressing it?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't have an example. But I guess my question is does all knowledge that we let me think of how to phrase it. Like the things that we, and I know the word possess is kind of a controversial word too, but like the knowledge that we have, do we come as blank slates to just being receivers in the world? And with that, does any part of what we gain or gather ever become embodied knowledge, like, or do the things we know and the things that we make work about always are always going to, I think this is a question I had in the residency too, like, are they always going to touch some kind of friction? Like, is it impossible for it not to? Because of something you said earlier, I think, the world just failing in general.
Well, the first thing is that we need to embrace friction. Friction is not a problem. It's actually, to me, is a solution. How we embody means how we perform through the body. So the knowledge cannot reside in the body because we're much more than the body. And the possession of knowledge is as you're saying, is questionable because it's not property. It's how it takes place, how it happens in context. So what we need to think about is how are we performing in relation to that knowledge, or how we are performing in relation to power. What I find really problematic about embodying knowledge is this idea that biologically trauma can occupy the body and can be genetically transferred to someone else, because this is a very racist and racialized idea that comes from, I think, the 18th century. And that's impossible. We cannot transfer, even if there's science. I disagree. I don't think it's possible. It doesn't mean that trauma doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that we don't inherit drama and trauma and we relive that. That's a social context that we need to think about. Because in I don't know if I actually uploaded readings about the pandemic, but if not, I'll check and I'll see. I think what it matters is how we experience trauma, how we experience illness even, because it is a system. How we get healthy has little to do with how the disease was experienced. So it's always a social negotiation. And in that reading I'll upload it, it explains how it takes place, because it's always in connection and in negotiation with others in context. So how we embody knowledge, I would change it to more than embody, how we perform it and how we use it and in what context. Because when we think about performativity, we need to think about time and space. In what condition, what is the meaning that being performed, what is actually saying. It's similar to authenticity, meaning the concept, the term that we want to question. Authenticity doesn't really describe anything, and we can reveal that when we think about how it is performing. So for instance, if I tell you this is an authentic pizza, what is it performing is authority in relation to place and history. So it's always thinking about what, and this also relates to the question that Victoria was asking. When we say anything about cultural appropriation, that is performing a specific context. So we need to address that, as opposed to, so if I create an Islamic geometric pattern that blah, 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 what I am performing there is this idea of the authentic in relation to the exotic. When in fact, what Victoria is interested in is the question of time and space in relation to the technology of learning and seeing, in relation to space, that has little to do with Islamic. It's just that it has been labeled through Orientalism in that way, and we're trying to find our way out so that it's not being racialized. So it is always challenging place and history. Anything that we think about in terms of art, remember, we have to challenge place and history, because there's always ties to that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we are coming to the end of the session and the residency. And as I always say, this is only the beginning of the residency. When the residency ends, it's only the beginning of the actual residency. And in that sense, we've been thinking about the different possibilities to explore collaboration. And we have come up with a few ideas that we will organize and email you guys in the next week, so that we have, because we see that there's a few things happening in the groups. And I think it's the moment to take action, because the readings will not be provided as often as we used to. And also, if there's any readings that I have not provided, or any readings that you might need, or any themes that you're thinking of exploring, please post it on the classroom, and I'll be happy to start organizing them and upload them. And I think it's a moment where you guys have to take action. You have to take lead and begin putting these groups into practice. I think there are many possibilities. And one of the things that I don't want you guys to lose as a focus is what we have created here is incredible. This possibility not only to connect, but to work in same directions with so many differences and collaborate in projects together. It's a possibility for funding, sustainability, exhibitions. I would not let it go. I would embrace it and take it as far as possible. So because we're not going to be having these sessions anymore, what I urge you is to start connecting with each other and start putting these ideas into practice. What I have found in my own practice is that readings and the practice don't connect. Sometimes they do, very often they don't, until you start working. And it doesn't matter if you think your images, your writing, your text, whatever you're working on, it's not responding to the question or figuring out the solution to the problem. It doesn't matter. The practice and the rigorous and the discipline of the practice will actually make you find the solutions. So in the next few days, we will send different suggestions and ideas to put the works, the groups into practice and facilitate these exchanges. And anything that you think we can help you with, please put a comment, please request it through the classroom. I'm going to leave this classroom, the actual classroom, indefinitely open so that you guys have access to it. And the readings, I'll keep uploading the readings. And also the videos, as Jocelyn was asking, they are on YouTube, and I am adding the links on the section where it says the transcripts of the meetings and also the actual recorded sessions. Casey, yes.
Real quick, and I'm sorry for bombarding everyone with that constant link for the Google Sheet, but I'll make those Instagram groups at the end of this. But I was just curious, do you want me to include the Arquetopia Instagram handle in those groups so you can stay involved and informed in that? Cool.
Yes, because that way I can also see if there's any questions that thematically or through the essays I can actually help you with. So I'll keep an eye on that, and anything that I think is useful, I'll refer it to you and I'll send it to you guys. So I'll upload it in the classroom.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. I think this is one of the most wonderful experiences we've had in the residency. Yes. It takes a pandemic to actually make it happen. I'm very grateful for this. And I see a lot of possibilities in the collaborations. Anything you think I can help you, we can help you with, please put a post on the classroom. I will upload new readings. I took a few notes on them, but if I'm missing any of the readings, feel free to request them, and I'll be happy to upload them. And I'll keep an eye on the work that you guys are producing collaboratively, and stay safe. Thank you again for everything. This has been a wonderful experience.
Yes, it's been great to see you again after many years. Some of you from last year or even this year. So Tonali will be in touch. We are planning how to follow with the group. So you will get an email from us next week with some ideas.
And the best form to resist is to make art, to start making. All right.
See you
See you soon. Take care of yourselves.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.